Hello, everyone. Welcome to another one of the Paul Australs lecture series. There is a lot of material you'll have gotten both out of this lecture series and that is just floating there in the debating ether in general on ways to make your speech better. This lecture does something slightly different, and it covers how to make your teammates look good. I think this is both an important attitude for debating and for your life in general, and just being a happier, more fulfilled member of the debating community. But it's specifically important for debating because you win and lose as a team. If you have your teammates' backs and make them feel good, they'll like you more, which is good for them performing well and makes them feel secure in performing well. But they're also likely to reciprocate and help make you good. And because I think judges will appreciate the intelligence of a team-focused strategy rather than a selfish strategy as a debater, and a high-quality debate is one in which you all just get better scores. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, go through five different ways in which you can make your earlier speakers or later speakers look good within the debate. So starting with earlier speakers. This is obviously a little bit more difficult because you can't really talk about the material that they bring because you don't know what material they bring. So it's about how you structure your speech and how you engage with things that'll let your later speakers have a good foundation for how they approach the debate. I have two bits of feedback for earlier speakers on what they can do. The first is very specific signposting. So explain exactly what you are doing rather than just dumping material into the debate. Because really, you're creating building blocks for the later speakers to use when they're engaging with the debate. And if they can say, as my first speaker said in their point, why Russian gas prices increase during times of geopolitical turmoil, rather than, as my first speaker said in her point on Russia, your later speakers will obviously be much more efficient. The judge will know what you said with more precision, and you will likely have a case that is easier to understand just in having to think about, well, what am I trying to do at this point? Second thing you need to do is iron out ambiguities from your case. Ask as many questions as you can during prep, because often your later speakers will have their heads in the clouds of the case, coming up with big fantastical ideas. And someone needs to kind of just sit there and be like, we should really figure out what type of sanctions we support, right? That's a very useful question for you and your team. And if you don't iron that out as an earlier speaker, it'll end up coming back to bite your later speakers. So make sure you're guarding their interests. The next bit of feedback and the next 4 points are actually what you should do to make the people in front of you look better. The first is consistency. This is an underrated quality, I think, in debating, especially with the rise of so much VP debating, where I just think there is naturally a much higher premium placed on novelty, placed on broad, flat engagement, rather than with Australs and all 3v3 debating, which is the test cricket of debating, in which you have to advance lines that are incredibly heavily scrutinized, and need to lead to clear outcomes for your team as a whole that is then just compared against one other team that is obviously engaging with you as tightly as they can. And one of the trends that needs to be people need to be very careful of is being inconsistent with your earlier speakers or inconsistent with yourself in a way that jettisons their material rather than rescuing their material and making it stick and give it staying power in the debate, often what people describe as like team lines. So in terms of rolling out this feedback, firstly, make sure you don't rebut yourself or chase the opposition's material so much that you then lose the overall picture of the debate. What you want to deliver in each piece of rebuttal you give is, here is our team's conception of the comprehensive, consistent answer to this debate, and I'm going to defend that line and deal with each part of the opposition's case as it falls into that overall cohesive vision. Sometimes, the premises of points that both you and the opposition bring will be in tension or will overlap. So you'll say, for example, in a debate about like vaccine mandates in schools, you'll be like, we'll fire teachers who put their students at risk. And then the opposition will be like, but then teachers will be fired. Like obviously this is the same premise of the point. And sometimes teams just start rebutting that underlying premise, saying it's ridiculous to say that teachers would be fired, not really understanding that actually means that they're contradicting their own material as well as contradicting with the opposition's material. And that's just because they're rebutting things too quickly, chasing after everything, rather than asking the overall idea. Well, yeah, it's okay that we lose these teachers. Here's why we don't mind losing these teachers. Here's why teachers in general will get vaccinated rather than resign, and giving a more comprehensive answer. The second area is when the opposition is contradictory. So if the opposition advances 2 points that contradict each other, sometimes teams will just attack both of those points in a way that then makes their responses as well contradictory. And you just need to be very careful that when an opposition contradicts themselves and only one of the points can be true, you say, here's which one of those I think is true. Only one of these versions can be true. Pick the weaker one, explain why that one is likely very true and needs to be comprehensive with the rest of your case, and then rebut that in a way that doesn't then engage in the same material you've just pointed out can't be true at the same time. Because if you're not doing that in a clear way, it just makes you inconsistent. It means that you might become inconsistent with your earlier speakers. You're not rescuing their material. You're not bringing their material back into the debate in a way that is relevant. So just make sure that you're keeping that consistency, because it gets exposed at Australs in a way that it simply doesn't in BP. Secondly, find a complementary style to what your earlier speakers have done. If your first speaker is very passionate, make sure you point out how her points were very reasonable, even though they were couched within that passionate language. If your first speaker is very mechanistic, make sure that the judge knows that the material was also very strategically smart and wasn't just losing the woods for the forest. This sometimes involves a subtle reframing. So your earlier speaker doesn't need to get everything right. The judge knows that obviously things will involve. So it's your job to say, these were the valuable bits within my earlier speaker's speech, then boost up that material, and that makes their speech comparatively stronger because it focuses the judge on the stuff that was valuable for them, and it lets you springboard into those new ideas in a way that then doesn't feel new to the judge. And especially if you're a third speaker, you need to be very careful about bringing analysis that doesn't feel too new to the judge, so that you don't run the risk of that getting shunted out of the debate. I think this is another reason not to speak too quickly as a debater. You are not trying to force ideas into the judge's head while you're speaking. Often you are also helping them explore what they already know in the debate. You're helping them evaluate things, and you simply can't do that at a breakneck speed when you are asking them to consider, here's what my first speaker said, here's how they responded, here's why my first speaker's material was still valuable. 3, isolate the conclusions of the things that you bring and things that your earlier speaker has brought, and then attach them to specific conclusions that the judge can weigh. So what this might look like is, say, at the end of her first speech, my first speaker had proven X. What I will do now is prove Y. So you're very clear what had already been proven in your first speaker's speech, and then making it clear how you're adding to it, which both boosts their score because it makes it clear what they've added, and boosts your score because you don't just blur into the material that they have already brought. Last thing that we'll talk about then is analytic rather than assertive cheerleading. And I love the word cheerleading to describe what you do for your earlier speakers, because essentially what you're doing is you're making it clear to the judge that what they've done is something that is valuable, that is meaningful, and that should be rewarded by any reasonable judge judging the debate. And what I mean by analytic rather than assertive cheerleading is you need to do things like, say, instead of they didn't respond to Daniel when he said X, wasn't it outrageous they didn't respond? Because teams use this in a pro forma way. Everyone accuses each other of not responding, and it's very rarely attached to reality of whether the opposition responded. Instead, what you should say is, Daniel said X, Daniel, the first speaker, they responded Y. So everyone almost always attempts a response, or you can say like the material that came closest to a response, but obviously you can intuitively see why it doesn't correctly hit the target. You want to identify what they have done rather than just pointing to an absence of what the opposition's done. So you say, Daniel said X, they responded Y. Daniel's contribution is not vulnerable to the response because of Z, so making it clear to the judge that there's still value in what had been said in that earlier speaker. But further to that, I'm adding A, B, and C, which is like making it clear then what you're adding to that particular conception. Because once again, what you want to do is isolate the contribution, make it clear what your first speaker has done, make it clear what you're adding. Just run that together. That we say, Daniel said X, they responded Y. Daniel's contribution was not vulnerable to response Y because Z stuff was already present in the way that they phrased their points. But further to that, what we as a team can respond is A, B, C. So isolating those different analytical bits. I think just the last thing, and general summative note to end this on, is that debating is most fun when you're getting on well with your teammates, when they feel like they are doing well, when they feel like you have their back. So make sure you don't lose the team sport aspect of this activity simply because you give your speeches in an individual way. It's the thing that gives debating the most meaning, and I think it's an under-disclosed secret of how many of the best speakers become the best speakers, not just because of what they're doing in their own speeches for themselves, but what they end up doing for the overall team and helping the other speakers in the debate.